We have Francis Fox Piven, who, that's right, according to the research I've done, namely Glenn Beck's site, she is responsible for every major progressive advance in the last 40 years. And I bring this up to counter a critique I often hear that left populist energy is often chaotic and undisciplined, and I'm like, no, there's a plan, and we've been following it. So thank you very much. And finally, we have Council Member Kshama Sawant from Seattle. Needs no further introduction, as you might say, but I'm not going to stop just yet. I was talking the other day about Debbie Medina and how maybe she could be the Kshama Sawant of the East Coast. But here's the thing. That's what we're comparing anyone who gets elected as an out socialist to. It's this woman right here who did it first and best in the 21st century. And it would be amazing if we could talk someday about, the first one in all 50 states and all the communities. And it really is amazing. And then she won a second time by, double-digit margin, which just goes to show that, it's actually being done right and it's not a fluke, and we're really grateful to have them here. These are the hashtags, People Summit and Socialism. Just want to say that the struggle for socialism will be fought on Twitter. Everyone who is going to be tweeting, please raise your hand. Thank you. We need a word that sounds like Stachanovite that refers to you. Thank you very much. Yes, exactly. And I'm going to pause now and allow the members to introduce themselves. Let's start with Kshama and continue on. Please introduce yourself. You have about 2 minutes just to sort of lay out what your priorities are at this time. This is the opening. Yep.
Sorry, there have been different terms to refer to what we're supposed to be doing.
Can they take the mic? Oh, thank you.
Well, sisters and brothers, thank you for being here. And I think that a lot of what we should be talking, in my view, at this session should be something that we should be discussing in all sessions, which is the question that is uppermost on people's minds, which is, now what? And I would consider it a gross dereliction of my duty if I did not, put in my ideas forward on what we should, where this movement should go from here. And that's the most concrete question. But I think a good starting point is to talk about democratic socialism itself, which is the topic of this session. What does it mean in our time? And just to lay out a basic definition of what we mean by democratic socialism. And when I say we, please know that I'm referring to myself and myself as a member of Socialist Alternative, which is a nationwide organization of economic and social justice activists. And we're also affiliated with many sister organizations around the world. And what we would mean by democratic socialism is very simple. It's the idea of a world, a global human society that is organized in such a way that it uses the entire technological and resources potential of human society in order to deliver very high standards of living for all human beings in an environmentally sustainable manner. So that would include all of the things that Bernie is talking about, but a lot more than that. But here is what I would say is the rubber hits the road. It's not possible to do any of these, let alone a fully socialist world, unless we actually take power into democratic public ownership in the form of the actual corporations that control oil, the financial sector, and all of that. And that really, in other words, poses the question of how do we get to that point? And then concretely at this moment, what is the most immediate way we can build our movement towards that? And I think we cannot answer that question right now unless we talk about concretely what are we going to do in the next 5 months in the presidential elections. And it is hollow, my sisters and brothers, to say that we're going to build our movement and not confront the most important question is what is the alternative to Trump and Clinton? That's a central question in my mind at this moment.
Well, I've been around a long time, And ever since I can remember, I have been involved in definitional discussions about what is socialism or what is democratic socialism. I've learned, sadly, over the years, not to engage in those discussions, but to engage in more concrete, practical efforts, movement efforts, to further social justice. I don't believe that in a sort of sweeping revolutionary transformation, I think we have to win one battle after another and build on those battles in a democratic and, if you will, a socialist way. But that said, I think that now we are at a particularly difficult and crucial juncture. A juncture that was confronted by generations, earlier generations, that engaged in electoral campaigns with great hope, great passion, great energy, and then the campaign was over. Sometimes their candidate actually won, but it didn't even matter if the candidate won or if the candidate lost. Once the election campaign was over, the activists, in a sense, were at sea. Did they just attach themselves to the candidate and work for her or for him? Well, they did do that, actually, and the results were not very good. They were not very good when Jesse Jackson did not win the Democratic nomination. They were not very good when Howard Dean did not win the Democratic nomination. They were not very good when Barack Obama did win the Democratic nomination. So I have a different suggestion. I think that the movement people who have been enlisted in the Sanders campaign, which, by the way, I think was remarkable, really an achievement. But I think it's time for the movement people to come home to the movements. And from the base of the movements to exert pressure on Hillary, the Congress of the United States, SCOTUS, the whole shebang, because movements are, in a sense, the basic source of power of a left. Thank you.
So I'll also avoid sorry, I should stand. I was trained better than that. But yeah, I'll also avoid a definitional kind of answer and maybe give a quick 2-minute kind of autobiographical one. My first exposure to kind of left ideas I encountered by accident. I'm the youngest of 5. My parents were immigrants. So I saw that, my 3 oldest brothers and sisters didn't get a chance to go to college. My sister and myself, who by the time that we were in grade school, my parents had, moved from like a tougher living situation into like a wealthier suburb. We were on a track that we were able to kind of go to college, and there was no difference in obviously our DNA between my older brothers and sisters and me and my sister. There was, the only difference was there was no difference in kind of this like culturalist explanations like, family responsibility and so on. No, my parents were just as focused on the well-being of all their children. The difference was I had access to some semblance of kind of an American social democracy, which, as Joe Schwartz and others, reminds people, it exists in America. It just exists in a very exclusionary form, funded by regressive property taxes and things like that. So I had access to a good public library that I would go after my after-school stuff. I had access to, a very good school district. My parents both went from working, part-time, hourly employment to both being employed by the state, working for New York City. So everything that I had that was good, it was very clear to me that this wasn't some result of, a personal, hard work or aptitude or whatever. it was very much the result of a welfare state. So I had that basic social democratic background, but then separately, when I was young, I stumbled upon kind of the Marxist tradition, and I stumbled upon more radical socialist ideas. You know, I read Trotsky, I read Lenin, I read Marx, I read all these things, and I felt that there was a real clarity and vision to how, you know, the fact that any progress that we get has to happen through struggle. And it's not just about envisioning kind of this warm and fuzzy future where we have single payer, we have even more radical things, like even more radical visions of a democratic society, but there's actually a small minority of people who stand in our way. So being a socialist to me is just about, in our communities, in our workplaces, in our homes, just kind of raising the level of class consciousness and actually presenting that kind of worldview to people in a way that actually, you know, melds with their lived experience and doesn't seem like a foreign kind of outside thing that's just being, you know, thrown upon them.
Thank you very much. So, this will sound dictatorial, but I'd like to institute a rule of no applause. It takes up too much time. You can applaud. Thank you, Left Forum, for teaching us that. And I thought that was a great, what you're saying really is a good segue into some of these questions. I have a list of questions we're going to get through. I'm actually taking to heart what Francis was saying, that we shouldn't get stuck in definitional arguments. The problem that I encounter as someone who's out in the world is that a lot of people talk about socialism or what socialist policies or politics ought to be, and there isn't really enough of a shared experience of people doing it together. And it's absolutely true that unless it's built on shared experience, then it's hard to have those conversations in the right way. And as many of you will know, even though the word socialism has become more popular, especially with young people, there is a lot of baggage. And I'm just curious, and I'm going to give like 3 to 5 minutes to each person to answer this. Why is the S word important or relevant or useful today? Which is to say, not why it's true or moral or superior or reflects a tradition that gives us good feelings, but how do you articulate that socialism is actually going to be used like a device that generates a return? And can we look to the recent past and the near future to understand how that's going to happen? And let's go in same order as before with the Bhaskar changing rapidly. Bhaskar, if you could go first on that. Thank you.
I think it's useful to call yourself a socialist. And I kind of, I had my doubts when I was a campus kind of activist, and I was like, you know, I asked David Duwalde, who was a YDS organizer at the time, you know, can't we just call our group like Democratic Left or something like that? You know, something vague, you know. It was the dark days of like 2008 or something. So, you know, nowadays it's like everybody wants to be a socialist. It's great. But I think, I mean, among other things, I think one of the reasons why it's useful is that it connotes the idea that we actually have an alternative, right? We actually know that society can be organized differently, and we know that the barriers to having a better society aren't technical, they're political. So I think that is denoted by actually saying that we're socialists. And what kind of society you want? Is it a utopia? No, it's socialism. You know, and obviously then that can like lead to a starting point for other discussions. And you know, beyond that, it's still an idea that that people are broadly familiar with. You know, almost every immigrant in the country is coming from somewhere that has. Unfortunately, you know, it's a sign of how weak our movements have been in the U.S., but has, you know, deeper socialist traditions and more active socialist movements in the United States. So this isn't actually a foreign idea for a lot of people. And also beyond that, in the United States, you know, it has, socialist movement has, you know, deep roots in the labor tradition, has deep roots in, you know, even the Socialist Party of America, all these other, you know, organizations that existed and had a real social base in the country. And I think calling yourself a socialist really connects you to that tradition, connects you to that past, and it actually facilitates this idea that you know, there is a some sort of type of common alternative that we could debate, but that we all broadly want to move towards, and that's a more democratic society.
This is hard. I am proud to be a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. But I have to say, I don't know if I'm a socialist. The word means so many different things. Remember, Mussolini was a socialist. Come on. It has deep roots, but its roots are very tangled. The Chinese Communist Party, is it capitalist or is it socialist? Well, I think it's capitalist, but I don't know. I don't think the word is going to solve the problem of first imagining and then constructing inch by inch, bit by bit, alternative institutions. Now, that also won't be accomplished. We've been using the word revolution a lot today. We have a political revolution. That also is a word that doesn't help me, and in fact makes me shiver a little bit. I think about the revolutions that we have had. I think about the Arab Spring, a revolution. Or I think about the glorious French Revolution. It didn't turn out well. It turned out with first Napoleon and then Napoleon III. Listen, I'm not telling you not to use the word because I don't enter into those arguments. But I am saying that the word doesn't solve the real problems we have, both of strategy and of goal-making or solutions. The real problem we have in devising strategies which draw on the political capabilities and resources of the people we think are our constituencies or potential constituencies, draw on those constituencies, resources, and direct those resources at the decision makers who are corrupting what it was already a very corrupt society. Do you know how to dislodge finance from its seat of power in American and world society by using the term socialist or using the term revolution? That won't do it. We have to try to invent strategies and experiment with strategies that mobilize the ordinary people, the folk who are potential constituencies for a democratic and, all right, a socialist society. We have to figure out how to mobilize their power, and their power mainly of refusal, because I think that is the essential popular power, their power of refusal in the interests of a more decent and just configuration of institutions. Words are not going to help us by themselves.
Well, I think there is no question of how much openness there is right now for socialist ideas. I think that we are fundamentally in a changed period. Yes, older generations did go through the Cold War propaganda, but look at the new polls that have come out. The newest poll from Harvard University in April of this year found that 51% of those aged 18 to 29 are favorable towards socialism. And yes, it is correct that, what Francis is saying, that, not everybody is on the same page about what exactly that means. But this is precious because it is indicating that the entirety of the younger generations of America are rejecting capitalism and the status quo and are looking for actual alternatives. I think that is the most important message to take from the changed times, not to quibble over definitions. But it is, yes, I agree with the other speakers, it is about mobilizing our power, and power rests in mass movements. That's absolutely correct. Movements on the streets and in the workplaces. But again, I think it needs to come back to concrete questions. Tens of millions of people across America, many of them younger people, have been energized and electrified by Bernie's message of the political revolution. And these are specific things that people are rallying for. Single-payer healthcare, the question of student debt, and what to do with that huge problem. The question of low-wage jobs and the need for at least $15 an hour nationwide. These are not abstract things on people's minds. People are thinking, and working people across America are not stupid. They understand. They're thinking rationally. And for them, at this moment, is the question that's staring them in the face is, we rallied behind Bernie, but the Democratic Party establishment stymied our working class agenda every step of the way. And so I think that if we are to discuss how to go towards a different kind of society, then at this moment the question really is, how can we build our movement on the basis of continuing to tie ourselves to what is the second most pro-capitalist and anti-socialist party of the world, which is the Democratic Party. The first most anti-socialist and pro-capitalist party being the Republican Party, And so this is a concrete question. How is there any possibility of moving forward on our political revolution if we continue to tell people that all those of you, all those tens of millions of those of you who are angry at the corporate establishment, angry at both parties, and rallied behind Bernie, now we are going to ask all of you to do exactly the thing that made you angry, which is support the corporate establishment. No, I think that is a bankrupt strategy to present to working people, especially young people who want to fight back. And this is a very unique moment. The left can't afford to squander this moment. And so I think concretely what we have to pose is an alternative to the Democrats and Republicans. And we have to discuss the question of Jill Stein running. I mean, if Bernie was willing to run on the Green Party ticket with Jill Stein, that would, as I have said before, be nothing less than a political earthquake, because it would provide the basis for building something that we need to build very soon, which is an independent party for the 99%. And I think that, and I know you're not asked to clap, but I'm sure that a lot of people are agreeing with what I'm saying. And the last point I'll make on this point is that our question of how we orient towards the Democratic Party is not it can't be approached from an emotional standpoint. It's a question of what actually works. And I wanted to tell you concretely, ever since I arrived at this People's Summit, I've had people stopping me at every step of the way saying, I'm so excited about what we've done in Seattle. And the question was posed, can Debbie Medina do what we did in Seattle? Absolutely. But there is a fundamental reason why we succeeded in Seattle. It was because we defied socialist alternative and the movement that we built through 15 Now. We defied the Democratic Party establishment that controls that city and that was absolutely dead against $15 an hour. A few days after I took office, I was sat down by Democratic politicians in City Hall who told me, well, that's all fine and dandy, you did this whole grassroots thing that you did in your campaign, but let me tell you, it's not going to work in City Hall. And do you know why it worked? Because I, as a council member, refused to limit myself to the agenda of the Democratic Party establishment and went to where the real power is. Yes, the real power is with workers, but you need an organization with us that will actually go to the power. Last night, Roseanne DeMoro said, when she was talking to Barbara Lee in Washington, D.C., Barbara Lee told her, look, we tried our best for, single payer. It didn't work. What we got was all we can get. So you need to, just accept that. And Roseanne's response to that was, no, I don't accept that because 58% of America believes that we need single payer healthcare. Why don't you go to them and bring their voice to Washington, D.C.? That is exactly what we have done. But it can't be done in the abstract. If we want working people's voice to be heard, then we need our own organization that is not tied to Wall Street interests, and not just tied, but the Democratic Party establishment is tied at the hip to Wall Street interests. And if we want to have our voices heard, then we have to concretely break that umbilical cord finally and build our own party for the 99%.
So this was something that we confronted when thinking about how this session was going to be organized. We knew that the question of what to do around Democratic Party politics, what the future of the movement should be, is a really important one, and we're glad that so many people have come to discuss it. But we also wanted to make sure that this specific session was going to explore democratic socialism with the intention of laying a groundwork. We know that while this room has many people who are very experienced in socialist debates, belong to different organizations, and are well practiced at polemics, we also know that there's a lot of people who are genuinely asking themselves, why is socialism important? What does it mean practically? How do big questions about something you've read in Jacobin magazine influence what we're going to do in the here and now? So I'm glad that we've been able to touch on these sort of larger topics about what's happening in the future, but I'm just going to put it out there that the purpose of this session is not to persuade for and against what we ought to do over the next month. It's to persuade for and against whether we ought to be organizing explicitly as socialists, and I don't think the answer to that depends on the specifics of what we're facing in the United States right now, 2016. It's a larger question, and we shouldn't only see that question through the prism of this specific moment. And with that in mind, I'm going to sort of go back to the questions that we had, and this one actually is very relevant to folks who are running and winning in local offices, and that is, when we talk about socialism, we're not talking about what's going to happen the day after we take over the country. There's probably not going to be that sort of bright moment where the flag is hoisted on the Capitol building. It's more about what does a socialist solution look like in our local communities before we have extinguished capitalism, before we have gained hegemonic power over the entire culture and economy. It's going to be something that starts small and expands from there. So I wanted to ask, what is an explicitly socialist solution at the level of local government or at the level of a state that helps us educate and lead forward around socialism without having the requirement that we actually win the big prize first before we deliver improvements, but actually establishes precedents that can be built upon. And I'm happy to go with Bhaskar first again. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, partially because, I mean, we need to be honest that since the 1970s, it hasn't been very clear that we have, for lack of a better word, a kind of left social democratic program, like a set of ideas that if we immediately had state power, we would know exactly what to immediately do and what to go about and, how to move in a certain direction. But that being said, I think on these questions, it's less about what particular policies you would introduce first and what particular policies we would push for, and more about kind of who the impetus for the policies are coming from, who it's going to serve, and whether they'll serve, like Andre Gores has this line he likes to call a non-reformist reform. So these are reforms that are good. Let's say a reform like increasing creating a jobs guarantee, right? So everyone who wants to work gets the opportunity to work. Now, something like that is not only good in the immediate, like it actually improves the lives of millions of people who are or underemployed, but it actually is good in the long term in that it creates a better condition for us to fight in the future. Because are you going to be more likely to tell your boss to F off and you're going to go on strike or you're going to quit or whatever if your conditions are bad, if outside in the economy there's 10, 15% unemployment, or are you more likely to do that if there's virtually no unemployment? So there's a reason why there was all these wildcat strikes and things like that in the early 70s and the late 60s, period of much lower unemployment. So things like that to me is what we should be thinking about and fighting for. Basic reforms that improve our standard of livings today and improve the lives of workers today, but more importantly, puts them in a position to fight in the future. And I think what's really clear here, and this is why I do think the socialist worldview is useful, is actually thinking about class in a certain way, that we see that when it comes to, let's say, climate change, we can't work with green capitalists in order to achieve the actual solutions we want to climate change. We might enact policies that subsidize or encourage certain actions, even as immediate demands within capitalism, that end up benefiting green capitalists, if that makes sense, because it benefits renewable sectors instead of old fossil fuel sectors, but that doesn't mean we want them as a part of our coalition. So I think that's really important. That kind of socialist worldview and understanding of class actually makes it useful, but it's less kind of a blueprint for immediate policies and things like that, because that's always going to be contingent on, first of all, whatever the people voting for those representatives want, because it's not something we can exactly, sketch out, ahead of time, nor would that be really, democratic.
think Bhaskar's suggestion is a kind of rule that we can use to judge, to assess reforms is very useful. Let's assess all proposals for reform by asking the question, do they empower ordinary people, working people, poor people, women, minorities? Do they empower groups that are usually disempowered, usually oppressed, usually exploited, usually have their goods and their cash extracted? Or do they empower those who are on top? If they empower workers, poor people, women, minorities, we ought to really pay a lot of attention to those reforms. And that does create a kind of platform, whether for a socialist society or democratic social society, or for, what about a democratic society? How far back do I have to go? Well, I'm saying that Bhaskar proposed a kind of rule. It's an Andre Gortz kind of rule for assessing particular reforms, because you know how discouraged we get by our reform efforts. We work very hard, we succeed, or we thought we succeeded, not much happens, then even that little reform is rolled back. Well, it's hard to be a reformer if you have that kind of vision of what reforms do. So Bhaskar is saying, well, here's a rule that we can use, credit Gortz, and the rule is will this reform create a kind of platform of power, empowerment, that will make it possible for us to fight for larger reforms? Now, Bhaskar proposed a kind of guaranteed employment reform. I would propose a guaranteed income reform. After all, why should people have to go to wage work under the conditions of wage work that now prevails in the United? Why are we fighting for that? Ronald Reagan was a reformer by that kind of criteria. Let's fight for a basic income for everybody. After all, it's a slogan, it's a campaign, it's a vision. It makes sense as a vision. So, with that agreed, I also want to suggest that there are many reforms that were achieved over the decades by ordinary people and their organizations, their political organizations. Some of them were called socialist. There are many reforms that are part of the sort of array of policies that we accept in the United States that could be called socialist. Why not social? Is public housing socialist? Why not? Of course it's socialist. Is the Bank of North Dakota socialist? I want to socialize every big bank. Is New York City's daycare program, before welfare reform corrupted it, was New York City's daycare program socialist? Sure it was. It gave low-income people access to regulated, responsible, reliable daycare. That's one of the things that a socialist society should do. We can work for many reforms that are, in a certain sense, part of the New Deal side of American democracy, and improve those reforms, expand those reforms. And if you want to call it socialism, I'm with you. Fine, let's call it socialism, but let's do it.
I think the question of, this is a very good question that has been included in the discussion, which is, why does it matter whether you call yourself socialist or not, and does it have a deeper implication as to how you conduct the struggle? And I think Bhaskar touched on a really, really important and essential component of what makes a struggle a different kind when it is led by socialists or by people who are thinking actively about socialism. I think what he talked about was the question of class. I think that is fundamentally important to whether or not we win many of those reforms, even if it is not a full socialism. I mean, all the examples that Francis mentioned, they are all free or affordable childcare, publicly made available affordable housing. All of these are components of what I would consider a socialist society. Obviously, they're not enough. It's not enough to stop there, but they are essential components of a future vision of society that we should be fighting for. But the question then, what it then poses is, how do we win these struggles, and how were the gains that were won in the past won? I mean, were they won on the basis of being willing to make compromises with big business and their politicians, the politicians to support them by asking them nicely? Or was it, and I don't mean to be facetious, I mean, there is an idea, and it is going to be even more and more aggressively posed to us. I'm quoting Jesse Jackson after he endorsed Clinton a few days ago. He said that Bernie's agenda and the Clinton presidency are reconcilable. I don't think they are reconcilable. And we have to understand that they are not, because of a fundamental class antagonism. I mean, if we understand, and this is where socialism comes in, if we, regardless of the specific definitions, if we understand that in order to win any of those things, if we recognize that we need to go up against the power of big business and the politicians that support them, and that we need to independently build our movements and change the balance of power on a class basis, then it also means that we need our own political organizations. And that's the strategy of socialism is reflected in how we fight for these things. And in fact, the question of healthcare is a very important one. I mean, this meeting is organized by the National Nurses United, and they have been passionate advocates of single-payer healthcare. And it's really important. And Bernie talks about Scandinavian countries and Canada that have single-payer healthcare. Very important reform, even under capitalism, if we could win that. But the basis on which they won those gains, just like the basis on which we won 15 in Seattle, was understanding that the power brokers in these two parties are not on your side, and we have to build independently of them. The reason Canada won single-payer healthcare was that the trade union movement and socialists built the New Democratic Party, which was then in opposition to the two main parties. And because of that momentum, they were able to win single-payer healthcare in one province, and then that became a national norm, and now Canada has single-payer healthcare. And these lessons are not, I'm not including them just because we want abstract history lessons, but because they are instructive on where to take this movement forward and how to win these things. And we're not going to be able to win these as long as we are tied to a failed strategy of allowing our movements to be co-opted by the same politicians who always say that, maybe we can win this, but then once they win the election, they say, we can't win this. And this is all not even, we're not even talking about the question of climate change, which I think in many ways poses directly the question of the need to break from capitalism itself. But even smaller questions like healthcare really show us that if we are to win any of these things, then the socialist strategy is important in the sense of recognizing who's on your side and who's not, and that recognition is on the class basis. And it's important that socialists fight for each of these reforms, because the process of struggle for fighting these reforms clarifies to everybody that we have this giant monster of this system racked against us, and if we are to win against it, then we have to build our mass movements independent of them.
So I'm going to change the way I was going to ask the next question, which goes to how do we engage in struggle as socialists? So just to use this as an example, I've asked as moderator for people not to use clapping to signal approval of who's speaking in their answers. And maybe there's one group in here who thinks that the right way to do socialism is to ignore that request and do it anyway. I've asked a question about how to fight for socialist reforms at the local level, municipal level, and I might have received an answer that was about national policy or things that are not in the immediate horizon for someone elected right now to local office. Is that an example of how we conduct socialist policies, socialist politics? This isn't a nitpicky thing. I think in the history of socialist organizations and parties, the question of how we fight for what we fight, what kind of party is supposed to do it, on what basis, phrases like democratic centralism, party of a new type have come up, Kautskyism, if anyone wants to really go crazy. And I think that there's a large population of folks who've been active with Bernie Sanders, with his agenda, and that campaign is going to be over soon. And they're going to be, in a sense, raw material for people who are saying, you should join the kind of politics that we engage in. And the calling card there is not only going to be which policies or political line. It's going to be, what do your meetings look like? What is the behavior of your supporters when they're acting out in public with other in coalitions? How does that function? What is the experience of people who are longtime members, and what are the stories that are going to be told by people who've left and air your dirty laundry? And I think that answering that question in advance, aspirationally, of what we want socialist politics to look like as a way of attracting the right kind of people and not only the first people who show up, is essential to advancing our cause. And I would love to hear, we'll do about 5 minutes on this question each, and this time we're going to start with Francis. And please tell us which organization you are recruiting for today.
Mike?
Oh, the mic. Charles took me aback. Charles took me aback, I said. I'm recruiting not so much for an organization, but I'm recruiting for movement politics today, because I think that at this stage in American election cycles, people tend to be sucked into electoral politics and to ignore the movement activism, the movement roots that gave them a voice at an earlier stage in the election cycle. So that's my recruitment agenda today. But Charles raises a set of issues which have to do with the climate, the ethics, the tempo and temperament that exists inside a movement or an organization, and how that feeling, that culture, that group sense, the group solidarity, the decency, the good food, the good parties, how all of that is essential if you're organizing a movement or an organization. And we never talk about that. We have a kind of very crisp and venal view about the organizing enterprise.
I'm glad you're sort of asking me to clarify. I think you're on the right track here, because one of the reasons why I think these norms or how we do politics is so important is that it's easy to be righteous when we're weak. It's easy to justify anything we do because we're on the side of the angels now that we're fighting against, the big powers, the 1%, the ruling class. But the methods and norms that we institute now are the ones that are going to be open to people who join us in the future, who might be more ruthless than us, who might be more strategic than some of our activists, who might figure out how to turn our systems into things that we don't necessarily like in the future. Not that there's been a historical precedent for anything like that. So I think the heart of this question is, I think the question behind the question is, from someone who's looking at this objectively, why should they trust us now? What have we learned historically about how we treat each other and others as we pursue power to achieve the things that we say that we want, which are definitely good? Francis, you may be done, or one more thought?
I think it's a beautiful idea. And it's probably not going to sell because its immediate payoffs are not obvious. It's hard to do. You want to create, as an organizing strategy, you want to create you, Charles, are calling for a beautiful community. And maybe a beautiful community could be an organizing strategy. I can't, off the top of my head, think of examples of such. Can you, Bhaskar?
Well,
Yes?
Beautiful communities, you mean on the left and existing? Maybe I should just should I wrap it up into my response?
I'd like to turn it to Kshama
Okay.
now, just to continue the process.
Don't worry, I'm going to think of something really good.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'm not exactly clear what the question is at this point because it was sort of rephrased, but I'll do my best. First of all, I think that it should be emphasized. I mean, the real point that we need to emphasize amongst ourselves, there's 3,500 people here today. It's a very important event. But we're also talking about what's on the minds of tens of millions of people. And I think, and among the ones who are most actively engaged, which is not tens of millions, which is probably some tens of thousands maybe, who are more actively thinking about where to go from here. And I think that there's no question that people are really seriously thinking about what the next steps are. And just to give you an example, I mean, myself and Socialist Alternative, and I don't make a secret, I am a member of Socialist Alternative, and I am recruiting to Socialist Alternative. I am not shy about saying that. And if you're interested, please come and talk to any of us. I think that on the left, actually, it is fatal to our movement if we are modest about our political ideas, because when we don't put forward our political ideas in an honest manner, it leaves a vacuum for those the gatekeepers of our movement who are tied to the Democratic Party, and I don't want that. I mean, that's why I will make every sincere effort to put my ideas forward. I am absolutely happy to have a debate on those ideas. Let's have a discussion and debate about which way to go. But I don't think there is that inherently putting forward your ideas is problematic. Actually, not putting your ideas forward is problematic. But just to give you an idea of what the consciousness is, and that's the main thing we should be thinking about, just one example. I mean, we talked about the poll, about the openness for socialism, but another poll, which probably is not poll so much, but as information point, which is probably less known, is that Socialist Alternative and I launched the movement for Bernie to support the people who are rallying around Bernie Sanders. And through that movement, we launched a petition where we said that urged Bernie Sanders that if you are stymied by the Democratic Party establishment, then we urge you to run as an independent through November, because we need your voice. We need your voice to carry the voice of working people all through November, and if possible right now on the Green Party ticket with Jill Stein. And we have had more than 112,000 people sign this petition. These are 112,000 Americans who are looking for a way forward and want to have that discussed. Where do we go from here? I agree with Charles that, right now, the people who supported Bernie are raw material. Yes. And I wouldn't want a condescending view about that. I wouldn't state it as saying that these are people who are thinking actively about it. It's not like raw material up for the grabs. But I can tell you something. If we don't fight for the strongest possible left challenge in the next 5 months to Trump and Clinton, then those people who are going to be demoralized at no way forward will become raw material for the Democratic Party establishment. And that will be a sorry state of affairs. And that is why we have to confront this question openly. I also agree with Francis. Electoral politics is not the entirety of the answer. In fact, in many ways, it's the weakest ground on which we can build movements. We need powerful movements on the streets and in our workplaces. But I think it is incorrect of the left at this moment to say, let's build movements, let's not confront the question of elections, because the only consequence of saying it like that and not putting forward the strongest possible left alternative is that people will either end up supporting Clinton in a moment of demoralization, or they will drop out of the political movement altogether because they don't see a way forward. It is our obligation to put forward an alternative to the two-party system that people are so strongly rejecting. And I absolutely think we need solidarity. We absolutely need solidarity. But, sisters and brothers, that solidarity has to be on a correct political basis. Right now, the Democratic Party people are calling for party unity. And I want party unity, but with which party? A party that supports Wall Street? We can't have unity on that basis, because unity with the Democratic Party means unity with Wall Street. That is the demise of our political movement. We have to have the courage to say, no, we want unity, but on the correct basis, on a basis that fights for our interests, and that can only be done if we put forward the idea of an independent party for the 99% and using a left-wing challenge this year as the basis to start building that new party.
Folks can clap with one hand. The next, thank you very much. The next question has to do with thinking about the future.
I'll take 30 seconds.
Thank you, people.
They didn't tell me I would have to say the good thing I was thinking of. Just that, yeah. So I mean, my answer is just a little bit, it's a bit broad. It just when I think about what socialists should do. Well, first of all, I should be more organized. I've been taking my notes on this. It's very hard to read my ideas. I think that we should, like I said before, raise the level of class consciousness and struggle in any movement that we're in, any movement that's going on. Talk about politics with our friends, with our neighbors, with our family, with our coworkers. And I know that sounds like very modest and very little, but to me that's what good socialist politics is about. It's about being a political center wherever you are and talking to people about politics, and of course, more importantly, asking more questions than giving answers. Because the chances are, if you're, any organizers would tell you that if you're, meeting someone for the first time, chances are they know more about their situation than you know about theirs. So I think certain things like that are I think a sign of what good socialist politics is about. I think there's no, the socialist movement, of course, has been maligned at times and has often been quite, sectarian, prone to infighting. Everybody knows that, but they also know that socialists have been at the forefront of every single successful mass movement of the past, century. Socialists were at the forefront of the civil rights movement, the forefront of the anti-war movement, all these other movements, and I think generally they acquitted themselves as, really good fighters for that movement. And I won't quote the person, but actually, someone I know who's in CWA and often clashes with socialists is like, you know what, it was useful to have lots of, Reds around during a strike. Not quite in those words, but, So in other words, I do think that's socialist politics at its best. That's what I want the reputation of socialists to be, which be to be the best militants, the best fighters, the most dedicated and selfless people. But that also means that we do have to do this balance, which basically means that we both have to be open and ask questions and be very ecumenical in our politics, but at the same time, we do also need to train each other and engage in these ideas really deeply, and that's the kind of balance, and that's a balance that we, at some very small level try to do with Jacobin, and we try to find the balance. Sometimes we do it well, sometimes we don't, which is at once be outward facing and be able to speak to anyone no matter what their level of political, background or level of engagement, but at the same time, really sometimes get into the weeds of questions and debates that might seem very insular because, it is useful to have that background sometimes. And that's a balance that I think at some level every socialist organizer, every social organization faces. And I don't think anyone has a really good, answer.
Thank you. And now, thank you. I'll go back to the question. And for folks raising their hands, we are going to have a short Q&A at the end, but there's a few more questions. What I want to ask, I'm thinking about your magazine, Bhaskar. How many subscribers do you have now?
16,000 now.
16,000. It's a real accomplishment. Imagine if it was 5 times as much, which is a number I don't know because I'm bad at math. If it was 5 times, if we had meetings, your branch meetings, and right now there's 10 people who come to those meetings, and only one of them is a hipster. If there were 50, you'd have 5 hipsters, and they could have a hipster caucus. And now you're talking. I'm from Williamsburg, by the way. So the point is that thinking very seriously about what it means for socialism to advance in this society, in this environment, not that that any one corner of it is going to see sort of all the gains, but it's probably going to lift all the boats. I was hearing from folks staffing the booths upstairs that many organizations are seeing increases in paper members and donations and the number of people attending meetings, and it's an indirect impact of this Bernie campaign that's lifted all these ideas. So I just wanted to ask each of you, and we'll start with Kshama, what precisely does it look like when the political situation is more or less as it is, but we have 5 times as much resources, members, influence, access to media, and so on? Give us a picture so that when we do the work that we do over the coming years, we really have a firm sense of what we're aiming for.
Well, I think, first of all, Charles is absolutely right. I think most organizations on the left, political organizations on the left, are experiencing an increase in membership and subscriptions, and I think Jacobin is an extremely useful and informative magazine that really gets people thinking. A lot of young people I know are reading it, and it's really great, the effort that's being made, and by other organizations as well. And I think that a lot of this growth that is being experienced by these organizations is directly related to the fact that we are in a fundamentally different historical period, where people are breaking from the status quo and are looking for ways to fight back. And so when your organization gets emails saying, I want to find out more, that's yet another person who is looking to get politically active. And that's very, very important that we continue to outreach. And I will again say, I think we should, on the left, we should have the confidence to do it in a very open and honest basis. I don't have a problem that there are other organizations also recruiting. What I would like is to continue to do more of what we're doing here, which is having an honest debate, and so that, and on the basis that we have the confidence that working people, young people, students, are able to make the correct political judgments. We put our ideas forward, and let's see what ideas are adopted by a more mass layer of working people. I think we should have confidence in our political ideas, to be very open and honest about it, and not really sort of demand solidarity on the basis where not all ideas are fleshed out fully. I think that's something that we owe our movements, that we discuss them very openly. And I think that concretely, what could be achieved by a greater mass of America being politicized, especially young people, I think concretely you can see by the fact that, first of all, we won an election in 2013. We won as an open socialist in defiance of the Democratic Party establishment. And, again, what does this mean concretely? 95,000 people in Seattle. Not everybody who considers themselves socialist, obviously. I don't have any such illusions. But 95,000 people in Seattle had to vote for us in order for us to win. That's an indication that people are really looking for alternatives. And as Charles said, we won the re-election again last year, and in between we won the $15 an hour minimum wage, and we have really pushed forward the debate on rent control. We've won some key victories along the way. We have not won rent control yet, but these are all concrete examples of how when a greater layer is politicized, we can make a massive, we can really push forward the movement in a big way. And, things, a lot of times things seem to be moving incrementally. And I agree with Francis, we should win every possible victory we can, small or big. But at the same time, I think we should be aware that consciousness can also move in rapid ways. I mean, we've seen a rapid shift in 1 year. I mean, when Bernie launched his campaign, there was very few people who knew that he was running. And now we have a global, international discussion about Trump and Clinton and Sanders. I mean, my family in India keeps asking me questions about Bernie Sanders' politics, details of his politics. Where does he stand on this or this? And where does socialist alternative stand on this or that? I think this has started an international conversation because this is America. And when people start discussing socialism in America, that means something real, for working people all across the world. But this is where the most important thing lies. That mood for struggle, the desire on the part of millions of young people to fight back, that does not automatically translate into organized movements, let alone successes in winning those reforms. It is not automatic. The left needs to provide leadership in order to do that. And we should not look at leadership as something that is condescending inherently to working people. As a matter of fact, the most condescending thing towards the working class and towards young people is to give a false idea there is no leadership, because when we don't provide leadership, there is leadership. That's the leadership of the status quo, leadership of big business politicians and others who speak for them. There is going to be some leadership. It's a question of who is providing that leadership. So if we are actually being honest and respectful towards working people and recognizing their ability to fight for themselves, then it is critical that we provide leadership that will actually fight for them. And that is why we want $15 an hour. Again, taking a concrete example, when we started talking about 15, it wasn't really on the consciousness of everybody in Seattle. But by the time we were about to win it, 85% of Seattle was staunchly in favor of 15, and it was very clear to every Democratic Party politician that if they voted no on this, that was going to be fatal to the remainder of their political careers. But that did not happen, again, as I said, automatically. It happened because we had a working people's voice in City Hall through me, and because we used our City Council office to really bring in the voice of working people and give them the confidence to fight for themselves and to come and demand this reform. And I think that is something that we should be discussing going forward. How do we provide leadership so that we are not only able to win some of these reforms, but also broaden the question on socialism? I really agree with Charles that this is great that we are talking about socialism, and it is absolutely necessary that we continue to clarify what each of us means by socialism. But it's also, but I don't agree that the larger discussion of a vision for a socialist society is disconnected from what we do today. In my mind, it is very much connected to what we do today, because at every step of the way, whether we win that final vision or not, is connected to what we're going to do along the way. How can we say that let's not discuss what to do in the next 5 months and only discuss socialism? I don't think we can get to that point unless the mass of working people are energized and feeling confident that they can fight for something. But how can we do that unless we provide a way forward, away from the very strategy that has failed us again and again, which is tying ourselves to corporate politicians?
I actually don't have a lot to add. I mean, I would say just to get to your question, I mean, what would we do at Jackburn with 5 times as many resources? I think we would look and read different, because if we had a bigger base. For one thing, we're not a movement publication, partially because, especially when we started the publication, the state of the movements in the U.S. were weaker than even they are now today. So that changes tone, it changes audience, it changes who your pool of writers and contributors are. So I think for one thing, we shouldn't have illusions on the left, and I don't think anyone on the left actually does, but that we already have some sort of mass base. What we do have is we do have the sign that people are angry and discontent, and this sign taking on political forms, including the Bernie Sanders campaign. But, I do think we have a plan if we're at that size, right? But this is a little bit of an easier, question, that it's economies of scales. I could break down our unit costs would go way down if we had that many subscribers. But, so it's an easier question for a publication to answer. But I would say that in many ways, Jacobin was initially speaking to kind of a smaller, more rarefied audience. And we didn't, intend it that way. It was just because of the nature of the left and where our movements are at. And now as we grow, we're speaking to a bigger and bigger audience. And it does change things. And I think it changes it in a good way, mostly because we want exchanges both in organizations and of course also in a publication to be kind of two-way. You want people and their ideas to mix and gel with the existing ideas we have, and for socialism to take on kind of a dynamic, living form. But, that's one of the reasons why, when we talk about, this is the only, intervention I'll make on this actual, question, because I know we want to stay away from it. But when we talk about, let's say, workers making a class decision, I myself very much fall on the side of, against lesser evilism, against the Democratic Party, but I also acknowledge that workers are making a class decision. They are basically saying that, voting for the lesser evil is a decision that makes sense for them, especially in swing states, because the platforms are different between the parties and because it might have tangible impact on their lives and so on. So in other words, having a dialogue partially means like acknowledging that reality and shaping our debates in kind of that direction that acknowledges that people are generally acting rational like they normally are. And like I mentioned before, often our first thing that we should be doing in the socialist movement is asking questions as organizers and activists instead of just giving answers right away. Though of course it's kind of a I was going to say dialectical process, but I hate that word.
This
so
is
I can't say that.
I just want to say this is the appropriate session to use that phrase. But yes.
I regard Bhaskar and Sawant, I don't know how to pronounce your name, Kshama. I regard them as political allies. Nevertheless, I feel sort of duty-bound to bring you all back into the continental United States for a moment. You ask, what would it look like, what would our situation look like if the left were 5 times stronger? And meaning by the left, the real left, right? Not the Sanders mushy left, the left. Well, 5 times stronger would not be very strong. It's a big country. Moreover, the right is getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And right now, there's a pretty decent chance that Donald Trump could become president of the United States. That's going to be our reality if that could happen. Moreover, there's a lot of enthusiasm for independent politics, for third-party alternatives. Have you considered the history of third-party efforts in the United States and the obstacles that they have floundered and fractured on? Bernie Sanders had a reason for running in the Democratic primary, and that reason was to circumvent the obstacles that have smashed third-party efforts for more than 100 years. So, I know lesser evil politics is like a curse word. But I think it's not unreasonable. I'm not sure, but I think it's what I'm going to do. I'm going to vote for Hillary in November. And I'm not going to work for her. I'm going to work for the movements with which I have always worked. Voting is not really a very powerful act. It really isn't. By one person? No, don't be silly. But listen, I want to buy time to build our movement. Trump may not give us any time. I think it's self-indulgent to delude ourselves with stories about our great power. We don't have great power yet. Bernie showed us a possibility. It was awesome. And I want to build on that possibility, and I'm going to build on that possibility by working for the movements. In the meantime, another 4 years of a deceiving neoliberal is what I will swallow.
Hold on. Imagine, the three of you, that we are constructing a newbie FAQ for the new socialists. They've heard about this session. They've decided that they're sold. They would like to be socialists, and they go online and they look for the newbie socialist fact that says, so you want to be a socialist, what are we going to do? What are you going to do? And it has to be very simple. It has to be written at a level where anyone who can put IKEA furniture together will understand what the next step is. So my question is, I'd love it if each of you could give, like, what are the first one or two things on that? For someone at any stage of life, at any stage of education, can say, if I start following this FAQ, then I'm going to be a socialist, and this will have some sort of positive impact on the world. And we'll start with, I think it's Bhaskar.
Yeah, I would just say, I'm not saying you have to join a formal existing, national socialist organization or anything like that, but you have to, talk with other people who have similar political thoughts or who you've been engaging with in your life, and you have to kind of, you can't do collective action alone. So I think what's key is really just joining in with other people, be they other people that you're going to do work as explicit socialists, be it a socialist study group or something like that, but then you're going to also engage in real existing actions, with in a broader left movement. That's why I do think that it is important that we think of Sanders and the Sanders movement as actually the left. And I think of myself, I think of other people on the harder socialist left as people who are kind of just keeping the seat warm in many of the dark days, like kind of just keeping the flame of democratic socialism alive, keeping a set of ideas alive. And now a bunch of people have it in their hands, and it's messy and chaotic, and it doesn't quite look like it looked in our minds. But that's so to me that would happen many times over in a larger movement. But I do very much view the Sanders movement as the actual left, and I do think that obviously it makes sense to be worried about the rise of the right and Trump. I do think Trump's going to lose very much. So I'm convinced of that. But I think that demographically we're better positioned. The Sanders coalition is younger, it's stronger, and I think it's better positioned to influence the next 10, 15 years of American politics than the right is. And that doesn't mean that socialism is necessarily on the rise. It does mean that the Sanders Democrat is on its rise with all that means. But anyway, to get back to your point, I would kind of just start there. I would start with just talking to other people, but realizing you can't kind of do politics in isolation, and knowing that this has to have some sort of life and energy and just to be involved in broader movements as ambassadors of a viewpoint that puts forward ideas of class and this analysis, not just for the sake of having ideas and being smarter than other people, blah blah blah, but for the sake of actually to be useful and to help these ideas help movements win.
The question is, what are the first one or two things that you would like to see people do to build a left? Okay? So, all of my left friends, many of them intellectuals, really believe that our obligation as leftists is to educate other people and thus bring them into a left movement, whether it's Sanders or not Sanders or whatever. I have a different view. I don't think that our educational efforts, whether it's journals or meetings like this one or various forms of educational propaganda, I don't think that they get us very far. In my experience, the educational transformation of people who were previously more or less apolitical occurs when they become engaged in a movement. Those movements tend to be movements about very everyday kinds of things. But the experience of actually working with other people, confronting indifferent aldermen, or dealing with brutal police, those experiences have incredible educational impacts on everyday people, on ordinary people. And that's one of the reasons that I am so enthusiastic and emphasize so much the importance of movement work. And it's great that DSA is growing. It's great that DSA is growing. I don't think DSA movements, DSA meetings, are effective in creating a left constituency as a movement that fights, for example, for better schools, or a movement that fights for a stoplight, or a movement that fights for a decent welfare system, or a movement that fights for child care for the women who have been forced into work by welfare reform. Those movements, which engage people not in terms of a reading of the Marxist greats or anything like that, engage people in terms of their real life needs. Those movements show people the power of collective action. They show people a side of the system which is true and nasty and rotten. Those movements will can create the constituency for a left that can transform America.
Thank you. Just a note for folks that are hearing buzz outside because it's 3:30 and that's the official time on the schedule. We've been told that the session should last until 3:45, so we're going to carry it a little bit further. And if there does seem to be too much noise outside, please come in and shut the doors.
I really agree with what Francis was saying, that active struggle is perhaps the biggest teacher for all of us. Just being part of a real struggle, and as Bhaskar was saying earlier, a real class struggle. And I agree also with Francis that these are the issues that bring a lot of ordinary working people who are not politicized, who are not getting degrees in political science in any way, but the issues that they come around are everyday issues, issues that affect them in their daily lives. And being part of an active and organized movement, learning firsthand the kind of obstacles that are put in your path, going up against the power of big business and the need to get organized itself, being demonstrated in real life, the need for effective strategies and tactics. I think those are perhaps the best ways to educate ourselves and others in the working class to fight and also understand what should that future world look like, a socialist world. That's absolutely true. I mean, just a concrete example, I think being part of the Occupy movement itself was a good teacher for all of us to understand, especially younger people who had not experienced the brutality of the police departments, to see how directly, the apparatus of this system can be used against activists. I think just an example of how being part of movement really is great, is perhaps the best way to learn. But I would also say that for those of you who live in Chicago or in many of the other cities that Socialist Alternative is located in, I don't think our branch, contrary to what Francis was saying, I believe that our branch meetings are very much, the discussions we have are not abstract. Yes, they include theoretical discussions as well, because that's important for us to arm ourselves with, because theoretical discussions bring in historical lessons that are very important for us to learn from. But at the same time, I believe that our meetings, our weekly branch meetings, are very much geared towards everyday questions. Just to give you an example, we have won some significant victories in Seattle against slumlords, and that's only because this is an active question that is being discussed by our members, by those who are interested in becoming members of Socialist Alternative and come to branch meetings and learn about these issues and then come to City Hall and fight for it, come, build rallies on the streets and so on. So it's very much rooted in concrete, tangible questions that ordinary working people are grappling with. To give you another example, our branch in Minneapolis is at the forefront of a ballot initiative for 15 Now. They have a $15 an hour ballot initiative that they're fighting on this year, and that is very much a campaign that is being waged by a lot of our coalition partners, but all the members of Socialist Alternative are on the forefront of that struggle. And by the way, who's against it? It's the Democratic Party establishment. And I could give you many other examples of how we are, we take our efforts and tie them to what working class people are discussing right now. And that's how $15 an hour came into existence in our, on our campaign platform, not because we decided that it was the best demand. It came up in our minds because workers, fast food workers were talking about 15, and we realized that that could be a focal point around which we could organize a struggle, and that's why we brought it up. So really our guide to what we do in Socialist Alternative is very much what working people are indicating to us through their mood, through what they're saying, and so on. But I also think that readings are also important, and I would just hold out that if people are interested, you should read, and if you haven't already, the Communist Manifesto and by Marx and Engels, and the History of the Russian Revolution by Leon Trotsky. These are not by any means academic readings untouched by actual struggle. These are about struggle, actual struggle, and they're very good guides to what went wrong and what worked. And we can really, I swear to you, every time I read those readings, it makes me feel like it was written just a few weeks ago because it's so relevant to our struggle today. I would also say that if people are interested, they should check out our newspaper, Socialist Alternative, because again, that is very much rooted in struggles across the country and also across the world. And it offers a guide, sort of an analysis of where we can go from here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's hear some questions. You, sir, in the front.
Hi, so my question is So my question is for Kshama specifically. I don't know if you recognize me, but I've met you a few times before. In 2013, I was one of the fast food workers that went on strike while you were campaigning, and you showed up to our rally with a big 15-foot banner of you saying "Elect Kshama Sawant," and that was the only thing you could see in any of the press coverage. So it looked like a Sawant rally. When I talked to Phil Locker, who was your campaign manager, about it, and about how we as the workers who went on strike were displeased, he said, we're all workers. So I want to know what kind of solidarity that is.
So before anyone answers, I just want to say, as moderator, I hope I've tried to sort of set a really comradely tone of discussion. I don't think your questions are relevant, but I don't think it's helpful to ask it and to demand that Kshama sort of defend herself on the spot in a conversation like this in front of so many people. I'm going to allow her to respond to it. Just want to put out there that I don't think that's the right way to have a conversation when we see each other as allies in doing stuff together. If you want to answer that.
Yeah, no problem. I do remember you and I, and we, contrary to what some people, you might hear from some people, we may have disagreements about how we do things, but please know from me in all sincerity that we don't believe in any idea of co-opting struggle, because that doesn't work for us. I mean, our end goal is not to build cushy political careers. I mean, the city council, just to give you a concrete example, the city council pays me $117,000. I take home only $40,000, which is the average worker's salary in Seattle. The rest goes into a solidarity fund, which we use for struggles like $15 an hour, like the teachers' union strike in Seattle. I mean, those are just concrete examples where the money goes, and we have a full accounting of that. And I have no desire to build, I mean, trust me, I work 100 hours a week. My life is not easy, and I would much rather be doing something private like teaching, which I used to do before. So we have no interest in building our political careers, and I know that this question is actually I don't consider this a hostile question, because I think that as members of something that's, as members of an organized movement, if we want to build something to fight back, it is absolutely critical that we look around us and be able to distinguish friend from foe, because that is an important distinction. If you're not able to make the distinction, it's actually often the death knell of our movements. And from our standpoint, as Philip said to you earlier, we are also workers. I mean, the movement that rallied behind our campaign was not me or a few well-influenced individuals or anything like that. It was a working class campaign. The campaign to get me elected was a working class campaign. So it doesn't make sense for workers to be pitted against workers. Everything that we did in our election campaign in 2013 to put the banner of 15 front and center was absolutely meant to put forward the agenda of the very workers who had taken the initiative to walk out of their jobs, fast food workers like yourself, to fight for 15. So I don't think that what we did was at odds with what you did. As a matter of fact, it was to provide the impetus to build that struggle and win it. And we would not have won it unless we, and me personally being in City Hall, being clear that the Democratic Party is not on our side and we have to go to workers to build our efforts. And I think that sort of is the basis on which we put forward our struggle, and that should be the basis, I think, for all of us, where it's not driven by individual political careers, but by honest discussion and debate, and where we all engage in real self-sacrifice for the good of everybody.
Thank you. Young woman in the white with the glasses. Yep.
I think the Democratic Party is the other party in America of racism and war. And, these so-called democratic socialists are nothing but Democrats with a little gloss on them. It's still the party of capitalism, and support to the Democratic Party still means crossing the class line. What we need is a revolutionary workers' party that is against and independent of the Democrats and the Republicans, and that fights for the overthrow of capitalism and for a planned socialist economy. The working class has the social power to do that. Groups like the Socialist Alternative, despite their name, are pulling activists back into the Democratic Party politics, the dead end of that. Sanders is not fundamentally different from Clinton. He has supported.
Do you have a question?
Do you have a question?
Let her speak. What's your fucking question? There's democratic socialism for you.
Yeah, right. And he supports Democrats, whether it's Clinton or Sanders, it is support to U.S. imperialism. And, if you're interested in revolutionary Marxism, you should check out the Spartacus League and its newspaper Workers' Vanguard.
Thank you very much. That's all the time we have for questions. Thank you very much.